My name is Ben Weiss, and welcome to our May virtual HSO Speaker Series presentation in collaboration tonight with our friends from the Cumberland Township Historical Society. 2023 marks a landmark anniversary for us here at the Historical Society of Ottawa, the 125th anniversary of our founding in 1898. In fact, this Saturday is the actual anniversary of that founding, when 31 of Ottawa's most prominent women, community leaders like Zoe Laurier, the wife of the Prime Minister, and Margaret Ahern, spouse of electrical entrepreneur Thomas Ahern, just to name two, gathered in the drawing room of the Speaker of the House of Commons in Centre Block on Parliament Hill and formed our society on June 3rd, 1898. So you probably figure we should be planning a big party. We are, but not this weekend. It's doors open weekend. And even a 125th birthday bash can't compete with doors open. So Saturday, we'll be announcing the big midsummer celebration we have planned for July 30th. And you'll be able to check out our website and Facebook page for full details. Throughout these past 125 years, we've been telling Ottawa's great stories, including now through our twice monthly speaker series. As you know, we currently run two separate parallel speaker series, one in-person afternoon presentation. They're held in the downtown Ottawa Public Library auditorium each month. And we have big news. In response to popular demand, as of the fall, we are moving our in-person speaker series to Saturdays to make it easier for more people to attend. Kicking off our fall in-person speaker series will be author Peter Atkinson, talking about the legacy of his dad, Gord Atkinson, the legendary CFRA radio rock and roll icon, who among other things was instrumental in launching the careers of Paul Anka and Rich Little. That will be the launch of our fall in-person speaker series on Saturday, September 9th. In addition, we bring our virtual presentations to the comfort of your home via Zoom on the last evening of each month, as we are tonight. When we return in the fall, we will be beginning our virtual speaker series with an amazing presentation about Algonquin Grand Chief Pinessi by Jim Stone, with an introduction by Murph Sarazan, Town Council member from Pikwakanagan First Nation and a proud descendant of the legendary Chief Pinessi. That will be our next Zoom presentation at 7 p.m. on September 27th. And so tonight we bring our speaker series to a close, our spring speaker series to a close, with a very special presentation in collaboration with our friends at the Cumberland Township Historical Society. Former townships like Cumberland, Goulburn, and Gloucester have long disappeared into the amalgamated city of Ottawa, but the history of those areas remains so important and so interesting. And that's why it's crucial that we continue to tell those stories and to support the local museums and historical societies that work so hard to keep those stories alive. Tonight, we have set aside our final spring speaker series presentation to hear some of those great stories of Cumberland Township. Leading things off tonight will be Gerard, past president of the Cumberland Township Historical Society. One of the great challenges with organizations like the Cumberland Township Historical Society and our own is always finding a fresh flow of new volunteers to come in and pick up the baton and carry on the great work we've started. Tonight, you're going to hear from two of the hardest working volunteers the Cumberland Township Historical Society has ever seen. And we're hoping that hearing tonight's presentation, others too will be inspired to join in the efforts to keep the history of Cumberland Township alive. And if so, Jerry and Ivan will be more than happy to hear from you. A reminder to everyone to type your great questions into the chat box during tonight's presentation, and we'll pose your questions to our speakers after the presentations. As a reminder as well, to please keep yourself on mute throughout the evening so as not to disrupt our speakers' presentations. And so, without further delay, I'll hand things off to Gerard Boyer to kick things off tonight.
So thank you for having us join you tonight. And my presentation is fairly straightforward. It'll follow the notes, and I'm basically giving you a background of who we are and of one of our great accomplishments in the time that I was president. So the where, the why, the when, and the what. So let's start with the where, Ivan. And sorry about the date. I did this presentation to the a chapter of the Genealogical Society. So thank you for the acknowledgement to the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan. I'm not sure about my pronunciation. Every now and again, there's a French part of me that comes out, so that Biblically, I'm aware of David and all of his heirs, but most people would say it's David and all of his heirs. So in this case, I pronounce Pikwakanagan the way I see it. And I don't need to add more of what was said. We know that we're on unceded land of the Algonquins. And one of the ways our association adapted from the time I began with them was to invite a member of the Pikwakanagan Nation to join us for installation of plaques in Sarsfield, Ontario, which would have never happened when we started working on our history. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about me. Born in Rockland, strong awareness of extended family in both Rockland and Cumberland, and a strong interest in history, a personal thing with me that I just enjoyed it. And then at some point in my life, it became a passion. And I'm a member of the Société Généalogique Canadienne-Française, and I have been heavily involved with the Cumberland Township Historical Society up until just lately, as of April. Okay, next slide. Just so that people are aware, I decided now that I've done some mapping, and this is generally okay at this scale, so that you know where Cumberland Township is. Okay, it goes almost to Rockland, and to the south, a little bit beyond Vars, and it includes a significant corner of the suburb of Ottawa. And on the map, I just put in some places to situate you, and I drew in the Nation River, the South Nation River, so that later on when I talk about Cumberland being sort of a little landlocked place, we're not, other than the front, the Ottawa River, where people were going from Montreal through to Bytown and west, Cumberland's like a place that's off of those main routes. Next slide, please. So Ivan, my co-presenter, reminded me that I didn't draw the southern line far enough, so it should go all the way down to 8 and include the town of Vars. I apologize for that. So you can see urban sprawl. So the top left corner, you'll see that mass of gray, which represents the encroaching suburb of Ottawa. And you're aware now that politically Cumberland Township doesn't exist anymore. However, one of our residents was able to get our name on the latest version of the federal riding of Prescott and Russell. The riding will now be called Cumberland, Prescott and Russell. So that's the way you'll see it when you vote. But other than that, Cumberland Township no longer exists as a political entity. It's been divided up into 3 wards, with the little section that I didn't draw on here going to Osgood, and then the other 2 sections being divided up into, I believe it's Cumberland Alea, and the other one is Navan Alea, but not sure about the wordings. So it doesn't exist politically. It exists only in the minds of the researchers when you're looking for properties. Next slide, please. Okay, so the why, okay, was the fact that I had all these ancestors in Cumberland and I had no context for them. So I got involved in writing a book about the early history, and I don't have an ancestor in it. All of my ancestors came later, but at least I know now what they came to, and it helps me understand a lot of the names my grandfather talked about. And I discovered all kinds of things I had no idea about. Our research included everybody that left any kind of a trace between 1798 and 1840. When we started this, there wasn't much of an Aboriginal intent in terms of context, because we didn't know of any Aboriginal histories in our area. And I'll address that in the next slide, thanks to some pressure from Ken. I think it's in the next section, we'll see. Oh, before I get there, right, the how, the eventual discovery of sources. There weren't a lot of sources to go from. We're not, I had a little snicker earlier when Ben was talking about the importance and the interest. A history of the Township of Cumberland is important for the descendants. I'm not sure how interesting it is for anyone from the outside, but we'll find out. But at least we're willing to share that history. So this is all that was available. There was a book written by Lucien Barrault. I discovered in doing the research a wonderful document written in 1897 with a heavily Catholic bias. So you have to take that into account, but at least the date takes us well back. And then everything else was done from church records. And you'll see there, particular Presbyterian church records and Roman Catholic records. And then property documents that were all over the place. During the time I did all of this research, the place has changed. And I'm now thankful for the resource called On Land, Ontario On Land, because I can go directly and find the information without having to find out where the latest registry office is. Next slide. So this is the period that I'm talking to you about. So 1798 to 1840. And the front of the township was surveyed in 1798. And it's to let you know that it's an extremely complex settlement pattern. It's all over the map. And we'll talk about that when I go through the table of contents quickly. In doing this, we'd lost complete track of the importance of the Foubert family back in the past. They're no longer a highlight family like other families might be. And we discovered the Old Forest Road, which I don't know that anyone, there's a section of it still exists in Vars. And I know I never knew how important it was, nor did I know where it went. So we'll talk about that. The other thing we learned is that Montreal was definitely the headquarters for Cumberland Township in that period. Bytown hadn't established itself yet, and it was further west. So I know as a kid, I always thought Ottawa was the most important town, but from the past, Montreal was definitely where everyone gazed back to. Bytown was just too far west. Next one. So here we are with the Old Forest Road. And the interesting thing about Cumberland Township is it was settled primarily off of the Ottawa River. So if anyone's familiar with Cumberland, if you go into the little village, and I mean Cumberland Township as opposed to Cumberland Village, if you drive into the village, there's something called Dunning Road, and on this map, it's in heavy red. And then in yellow, I put in what is now the Sarsfield Road. And the early settlement road went somewhere in between there, and it basically followed the high ground. So that we believe that that purple line, the road that went through there, was originally a First Nations footpath. We have an oral source that says that that's what the early settlers, and the reason that road was used it was for the settlement of Bear Brook. So properties along the Ottawa River were first populated, and then there's a group of settlers who bypassed everywhere else, and they followed this road along the high ground to Bear Brook and settled there. So that'd be about our second oldest community, which is unusual today. You wouldn't think that someplace far back, but I believe we'll explain that in a little bit. Okay, if we continue. So here we go. I've basically just put the chapters of the book we published. I won't refer to everything in it, but I'll just run through it. The organization of the book was dictated by the research because we had no organizational framework to work from. What we had was a surveyor's map of 1840, where the surveyor had done a pencil sketch of houses without identifying them, but he roughly drew the lots and concession numbers. So we were able to match that up with assessment rolls. And we were eventually able to identify everyone that lived and where they lived in 1840. And from all of that information, we did all the research. So basically, you know, the first founding families were Dunnings, Ortons, and Fouberts. And it's quite a mix. The Dunnings and Ortons were from the United States originally. At that time, which was fairly new, the Ortons, some of them were Mormons at that time. And of course, the Fouberts were Roman Catholic French. And right off the bat, a Dunning married a Foubert, which complicated things a little more. So that along the Ottawa River, there was one lot where Cumberland Village now exists that was owned by this Mr. Foubert, a staunch Roman Catholic, married to, I guess the Dunnings became Presbyterian, but originally they were American Anglicans. So you get that strange mix right off the bat. And then on every other lot to the east and west of them, it's either Irish Protestant or Scottish Protestant. So it's a strange mix that started right off. A little note, there was, so I go to the Fouberts and I talk about that family, and they're known all over the valley. That history had been lost and we've resurrected some of it. Their history is better known on the Quebec side of the river. A little note in chapter 4, there was speculation back then. So if you'll note, there was a sale in 1821 of 4,423 acres of land in Cumberland Township. So there was lots of real estate going on at the time. There were 2 surveys done, and the surveyor of the second survey was paid in land, which he eventually sold off to a rich person from Montreal. Now, we haven't gone beyond the 1840 date, so someone else would have to trace all of that. Chapter 5, French Canadians in the northwest corner of Cumberland Township. Well, we call that Orléans, and I pronounce it because I grew up knowing it as Orleans. However, in doing the history, Orléans was definitely a French settlement in the beginning, and they've reclaimed that and made sure that every sign they can get that accent on, they get it on. So, that little northwest corner is really part of the story of Orléans. And they have an active historical society, a French language historical society, which would address the descendants of those families. There was someone in our group, the work on the history book was the work of 4 volunteers. So someone had a lot of information on the Wallace and Burns family. So we put in a chapter for those. The old Kirk community. So it just lets you know that we took all of the Irish Protestants and Scottish Protestants and lumped them into that chapter because they all worshiped at the same church. And then we did a chapter on the Irish Catholics because, of course, they wanted a Catholic church, which was complicated by the fact that there were French Catholics there also. And that's very similar to the story of Bytown in the beginning with Notre Dame, which I believe in the beginning was primarily Irish Catholics and then became predominantly French Catholics. So the Irish left and formed their own church. Well, Cumberland never got big enough to do that. Then we talk about the Bearbrook settlement. So I referred to the Old Forest Road. So there's a group, and that would be what you'd call chain migration. They were all Anglicans. They were all from a certain part of Ireland. And the whole thing was planned over about 10 years. They cut out the road, and parts of that road have disappeared under gravel pits. Parts of it still exist through farmers' fields. And as I said, the town of Vars, the downtown of Vars, if I can call it that, still has a segment of that road, and it's called an Old Forest Road. And Ivan has 2 historic plaques to put in to the ground, which has taken us a year. We didn't realize how COVID affected our relationship with the city of Ottawa. Everyone we used to deal with was gone, and it's taken us about a year and a half to be able to get those plaques in the ground, which we now have approval for. A couple of interesting characters came along. Their name were Henry and John Sims. And their legacy is that they had an architect brother who came to visit them in the 1840s, and he did watercolor sketches of the only pieces of land in Cumberland Township that have ever survived, that have ever been painted. So that we have those in our book. And none of these fellas stayed because it was too hard of a living to make. They left, but they lived right next door to Archibald Petrie. And his history has also been lost, but we resurrected it. So those of you who are familiar with Petrie Islands, he owned them at one time. He would be what you would call a distinguished gentleman. He was the first reeve of the township. And interestingly enough, he was one of 3 people who decided on the location of the City of Ottawa jail and the registry office. We'll skip 13. That's a particular family that we couldn't place with anyone else. In Ontario, if you were French Canadian and you settled someplace, although everyone was French, you never called it with a French name at that time. So French Hill is immediately at the end of the Foubert family that I talked to you about, who had the lot right in the middle of today's Cumberland Village. because there was no place for French settlers to come on to land to the east or the west, well, they basically went through his land to get land in behind. And there's a hill behind Cumberland, 2 hills back, where it's not so swampy and wet. So there's a whole cluster of French Canadians who settled there. It was known as French Hill. I now know why. All of the settlers were French. And the town of Sarsfield, if you've ever heard of it, used to be called Dough's Corner, and Dough is a French name also. But again, didn't have a French name, and even Sarsfield got an English name after a famous Irish-British general. At the time that we were ending around 1840, the town of Navan still didn't exist, but there were people there had settled. And that's the first time that we encounter settlers coming in along what today is called the Navan Road. So there were 3 settlers at that point who'd come in from the Bytown side of things. But up until then, all of the settlement came in off the Ottawa River and had no links with Ottawa whatsoever. The 1837 rebellions, they mustered a militia, nothing ever happened. But we do know that some men, there's an interesting story that a bunch of men went to Ottawa to train. They drilled for a day, got a new pair of boots, and then they came back to Cumberland, and that was the end of it. There was no activity. Can you scroll up a little bit, Ivan? Does that happen, or is chapter 16 the end? I can't see on my screen.
Sorry, Jerry, that's the end of the page.
All right, then that's fine. Okay, so if you go on, I think, am I done? Oh, right. What we did, so that people are aware, is that we have a chronological list of the land grants in Cumberland Township. And then we also did the settlement in chronological order because they hardly match. So as a little note, there was no United Empire settlement in Cumberland. But if you followed the land grants in chronological list, you'd think that there were a whole pile of United Empire loyalists came. They got land here, but it was so far from the St. Lawrence that they eventually sold their land off to other people. So that anyone thinking that Cumberland Township had some United Empire loyalist history, it doesn't. It's a combination of poor Irishmen, both Protestant and Catholic, of fairly decent farmers from Ireland, mostly Anglican, and then French Canadians looking for a place to live off the Ottawa River. We have excerpts from a diary that was written in the 1840s of someone who came and visited his in-laws. And that's about it. So I hope I gave you a little bit of a flavor of sort of the early history of Cumberland Township. And at least we've created a great foundation. We've also listed on our website, we did family trees for all of the families, whether they stayed or not, on our website. And it's indexed. So if anyone's interested in families in Cumberland Township, we covered it all. So there's still lots of history to be written by other generations, but that's the foundation. And now I will pass on the presentation to Ivan, who is our storyteller. So I'm more of a sort of facts and history person. Ivan's our storyteller. And he came up, I mean, he knew about this story. And when he wondered whether he should publish it or not, we gave him all kinds of encouragement. So you should enjoy this story. And if there's any other questions I can answer about the early beginnings of Cumberland Township, you can address those questions later. Ivan, the floor is yours. And I want to thank Ivan for all of his work on the Cumberland Township Historical Society. I resigned just last month, but Ivan is in charge of a committee to see who's going to carry on. And he's been a terrific director on our Historical Society and very active, showing up at all the Navan fairs and being part of a very efficient team of historians who've put in plaques and written a few things. So Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Good evening, everybody. So how did this story begin? As Jerry alluded, I had heard this story. My brothers and I heard this story when we were boys from our father. He told us about this constable, this policeman that was murdered. And at one point, I was discussing it with Jerry as our president, and Jerry says, "Ivan, you should write something up about this." So Jerry, you probably could tell he's a silver-tongued devil, so he talked me into it. And I said, "Sure, I'll look into this." So I started researching and researching and researching, and I found absolutely nothing. A police officer's been murdered, and there's no information available anywhere. As luck would have it, a short time later, I was going through the Saturday Citizen online, and I see there was a fellow named James Powell who used to do historical pieces in the Saturday Citizen about things that had happened in the Ottawa area. And we all know James Powell is a very active and key member of the Historical Society of Ottawa. So I contacted James, and he showed me where to go and how to find it. And I went online, and sure enough, I found the Ottawa Evening Citizen from 1880. And there it was. There was the whole story. So I started transcribing the story. I copied them all. I transcribed them all. And eventually we had enough information that I was able to put a booklet together, and then enough that we could do this talk. So we'll take a quick look at Cumberland Township in the 1880s. I think there's a little laser thing here someplace that, no, oh, here it is. Sorry. All right, there we go. So as Jerry alluded, the south half of Cumberland Township here, it's a very odd area, and we still don't know 100% how it happened, but it's a very homogeneous area. The bulk of the settlers here were English-speaking Irish Protestants. They came from I believe about 8 different areas in Ireland, and as Jerry says, we would call that today chain migration. And you understand why. You're going halfway across the planet to a place that's a wilderness. You don't know anybody. If there's people there that are maybe friendly faces or might be able to help you out, you're going to settle in that area. There were probably in the 1880s, probably only about 150 families living in the south half of Cumberland Township, coming from the same villages in Ireland. Most of them had been interrelated before they left Ireland. And then once they got in this rural southern Cumberland, those that weren't related before they left Ireland very, very quickly became interrelated in southern Cumberland. There was the problem of the poor roads. The Forest Road, as Jerry said, comes north-south here, and then it cuts across at an angle. And then there's another road comes out from Ottawa. So that was the 2 roads. And in the middle here was the village of Bear Brook, which was quite prosperous at about that time. And on the boundary with Russell Township, there was a little community called Veyton. So those that, like I say, they were interrelated before they left Ireland because of the distances to travel, and for the most part, strict societal rules about who you could marry. Everybody who wasn't related in Ireland very quickly became related here. Also, along this road here, this is actually would today be part of Russell Road, coming out from Carlsbad Springs. Mr. J.R. Booth was building his Canada Atlantic Railroad along here, and it was under construction in 1880. Okay. So again, for perspective, Canada in 1880. So after considerable political turmoil, the Canadian Pacific Railroad was back on track again, and it was in the process of opening up the West. Canada was still in the midst of what they refer to as the Long Depression. There'd been a worldwide depression take place through the 1870s. And by 1880, many parts of the world were starting to emerge from it, but Canada was still stuck in the midst of this big depression. For all intents and purposes, there was no social safety net. The churches would do a little, family, friends, neighbors would all do a little, but a social safety net, as we know it today, simply didn't exist. And the other thing that happened in the midst of this depression, families at that time, rural Cumberland, well, most rural parts of Ontario and Canada, were having very, very large families. So you can imagine your 100-acre farm, you have 10 or 12 boys. is going to be pretty small pieces of property. So the government had the Dominion Lands Act of 1872 to encourage people to migrate west and to start to populate that area, which they did. Law and order in the Canada and Ontario in the 1880s. It was certainly something that we are basically totally ignorant about. In Ontario at that time, only the very large municipalities had career police officers, and there was a serious debate going on across Ontario at that time. What do we do about policing? So do we hire full-time policemen? We pay them full-time salary, and there's no guarantee of any productivity whatsoever, as opposed to paying somebody what we would call piecework today. So, you know, hey, you do this, we pay you this. So and justice was administered by traveling judges and appointed justices of the peace. So these justices of the peace were appointed as required or as the need was. And throughout rural Ontario, the law was enforced by a county high constable. Each county had a high constable, and that constable had the power and the authority to appoint county constables. This was an appointment job. It was a part-time job, and it was in the this is about the era of the Black Donnellys. So it wasn't really, you know, Ontario was mostly a peaceful place, but not necessarily exclusively. So the county constable, this was an appointed position, but it couldn't be refused. Interestingly enough, it could not be refused. It was, so think about jury duty today. You get your call for the jury, yeah, you're in. So the county constable was something that that couldn't be refused. And they had the wording such that if you purposely tried to sabotage your career as a county constable, you could be charged for that as well. The number of county constables was at the discretion of the county high constable, and there was basically very, very little or no training in the position at all. And these county constables enforced everything. So they did dog catching, bylaw, wildlife, health regulation, criminal law. These guys did it all, no training whatsoever. And they were supported when needed by professional provincial detectives. The equipment that these constables were provided with was a baton and a pair of handcuffs. That was it. That was it. So just to give you some idea, this page is taken from the constable's handbook. And I can say it's basically a piecework. So this is what it would pay. So if you arrested somebody, you would get $1.50, which was actually pretty good money in 1880. If you served somebody a summons or a subpoena, you would get 25 cents. Mileage to serve summons, a subpoena, etc., was 10 cents a mile. On one hand, it's very, very generous, but on the other hand, these guys are going by horseback, and nobody would, I doubt very much anybody would go any more than maybe 5 miles in any one direction, unless there's very exceptional circumstances. So mileage for taking a prisoner to jail, all the mileages is $1. If you have to attend a justice or summary trial, you would get a whole dollar. And if that took you more than 4 hours, you got $1.50. So that'd be $1.50 for the full day. And if you attend assize court or sessions court every day, you got $1.50. Once again, mileage was 10 cents. And summoning jury for coroner's inquest, you got to remember, they want a jury, there's no telephones. So the county constable, he would go around and knock on everybody's door and tell them, by the way, we need you for jury duty. And for that, he would get $2. So this is actually pretty good paying work for piecework. And this was a part-time job. And as I said earlier, there was very, very little cash in the country at that time. So, you know, if a fellow was able to supplement his, and most of the farms would have been subsistence farms. So if a fellow was able to supplement what he was making on the farm with some hard currency, that would make a huge difference at the end of the day. So Cumberland Township again, here we are in the south end of Cumberland Township. So our cast of characters for this evening's story. So character number one, down here at the bottom, you might even be able to see the name on the map, is John Morrison. So John was 32 years old. He was a farmer. He was the part-time constable. He farmed 25 acres of land on concession 7, lot 26. Isabella McNally, she was the daughter of Henry McNally, and she's John's wife, and she is the mother of Emily Jane, that's called Jenny. Jenny was 8. Son James was age 5. John Wes was age 2. And she was pregnant with a son, William Edward, be called Edward, and he would be born on September 21st. So this is where they lived here at number 1. Henry McNally was John's father-in-law. He was up here number 2 on the map. So Henry was his father-in-law. He was a witness the day of the incident, and he lived on concession 7, lot 25 west. And he was the son of Reverend James McNally. Jerry talked about that original, I think there was a group of 5 settlers that followed the forest road down here to the Bearbrook area around mid-1820s, and they established the Bearbrook settlement. And this Reverend James McNally was one of those settlers. Then we had James Lowry down here, number 3 on the map. So James, he was a neighbor of the Morrisons, and he was a farmer, and he was also a justice of the peace. The next is John Harrison Jr. So John Harrison Jr. who's up here, number 4. He's a farmer, on concession 7, lot 18, and John Harrison Sr. And he's the father of John Harrison Jr., James Harrison, and Annie Harrison, who would be married to William Haney. The next character is William Bill Haney. He's a farmer up here near the top at concession 3, lot 16. So he's married to Annie Harrison, and he's living with the Harrisons down here over the winter of 1879, 1880. Gilbert Nelson, he's a farmer. He's at number 6. He's on concession 7, lot 18. He's a neighbor of John Harrison's. And then we had up near the top, hopefully you can see it, number 7 is Samuel Rothwell. He's a farmer, and he's also a justice of the peace. So he would be, the Rothwells actually still live just outside of the village of Navan. So that's our main cast of characters. So now the story, finally. Friday, November 28th, 1879. James Harrison was preparing to head up the river to the shanty for the winter. I mentioned the lack of currency, the lack of hard currency. What most farmers, or many farmers and people through the area did, is over the winter they would let all of their cattle go dry, so they didn't need to be milked, except for one. They would keep one cow milking, and your wife would be able to milk that over the winter, so you would have fresh milk for the house, for the kids. And the farmers would go up to the shanty to work in the bush for the winter, and they would come home in the spring with that incredible hard cash in their hand. Maybe they could buy another cow or a horse, or buy a piece of machinery, but they would have the cash in hand to do that. So he was preparing to go up to the shanty for the winter. He and his brother-in-law, Bill Haney, went over to his brother John's. So this is John Harrison Jr. He's going to sharpen his axe before he heads up to the shanty. Sounds like a reasonable thing to do. So John Jr.'s wife, Jemima Simpson, was home alone with their young children. After sharpening the axe, the 2 men entered the home, and there was an altercation between Bill Haney and Jemima. The next day, Saturday, November 29th, Jemima made her way 5 miles south to Justice of the Peace, James Lowry's farm. She wanted to swear a complaint. Lowry was a justice of the peace as well as a farmer, but he was not home that day, so she walked the 5 miles back home again. She returned on Monday, December 1st. She walked back down again and swore a complaint against Bill Haney. She swore that while in her home, he had clenched his fist and struck her, knocking her to the floor and sending the baby in her arms flying across the room. further that he had smashed the windows and door. So again, for perspective, this is just winter is imminent. We're the end of November. Winter is imminent. It's coming any day. Glass is very hard to come by. It's very expensive. He smashed the windows. He smashed the door. Winter is coming. He's assaulted her. He sent the baby flying. So Justice of the Peace Lowry issued a warrant for Haney's arrest, and he gave it to County Constable John Morrison, who had the farm virtually backing on onto Lowry's. So he gave him the warrant, and Morrison went to arrest Haney up at his father-in-law's, John Harrison Sr.'s farm here, but Haney had already fled. Morrison continued to search for Haney throughout the rest of the fall and through the winter, and finally he located him in Winchester Township on February the 5th of 1880, and he arrested him. He brings him back here to James Lowry's, and Lowry has with him that day another justice of the peace named Hamilton. So they appear on February 7th before the two justices of the peace, and Haney pleads not guilty. And he stated that his brother-in-law, James Harrison, would testify on his behalf when he got home from the shanty, and a hearing was slated for February 14th. So clearly they've sent word up to the shanty somehow. He needs James to come home and be a character witness for us. So Haney was given until the 9th to provide a surety to allow his release. So today it'd be bail. I guess whether it would be a piece of machinery that he would have to forfeit while he was on release, something along that nature. At this point, Haney decides that he needs legal help, and he convinces Morrison to take him into Ottawa to see a lawyer named Musgrove. So Morrison agrees, and during the meeting with Musgrove, he's told that the warrant against Haney isn't worth the paper it's written on. Again, the justices of the peace, most of them would have had no or little legal training. I believe the policy was, and I think it may even have been in effect up until the 1960s in Ontario, to pick prominent people from various communities of good character and good judgment, and they would rule on these many of these cases. So the warrant's not worth the paper it's written on. So Morrison had to release Haney, and they traveled home together. I expect it was not a particularly chatty trip all the way back home again. So now, by this time, Jemima Harrison's husband, John Jr., has returned from Manitoba. And on hearing of Haney's release, he again goes to Justice of the Peace James Lowry, and the charges were relayed. So John Morrison has the warrant now given for the second arrest, and he goes to arrest Haney, staying at his in-laws here, the Harrisons. And as he enters the house, Haney escapes out the back window. Meantime, Haney's wife, Annie, is armed with an axe, and her mother, Sarah Harrison, is armed with a butcher knife, and they force Morrison into a corner while Haney makes his escape. Both women were later arrested and charged with assaulting Morrison in the discharge of his duty. After a brief stay in jail, Sarah was fined and Annie was released. And then word was spread throughout the area that Bill Haney had escaped to the United States. However, later testimony indicated that he was in fact in Bell's Corners. So what we see going on sometimes in the news or in the politics today really isn't that new. So in his absence, it seems that James Harrison was busy going from farm to farm. They had no TV, no radio. Most people didn't have access to newspapers other than maybe once a week, once a month, whatever. So people talked. They go to church, they talk. People would go visiting neighbors door to door, and they would talk. So we've got James Harrison. He's a busy guy. He's going from farm to farm. He can hardly wait to tell people the story about how these two women had this big burly cop all bundled into a corner and crying like a baby. And he's telling everybody that'll listen. In the meantime, while this is going on, John Harrison Jr. packs up his wife Jemima and their family, and they head out to Manitoba to settle for good. The spring of 1880. In mid-April, James Harrison stops at a neighbor's, Andrew Nelson. Andrew and his son Robert are building rafters for a barn. Harrison gossips, of course, about his sister-in-law Jemima, and then he retells the story about Morrison, and adding on top of it now that he'd like to beat him up if he had a chance. Morrison is over 6 foot. I don't know how busy or how big of a man James Harrison was, but he was certainly a chirpy little fella. Anyway, he's going to beat him up now. So there's a while here that Harrison seems to go out of sight. Spring of the year, he may actually have been cropping or doing actual farm chores instead of going around stirring things up with the neighbors. June the 5th, John Morrison's, Constable John Morrison's father, James, died of tuberculosis. About the same time, early June, a young man named William McVeigh, so down here at Veyton, that's where the McVeighs live. So young William McVeigh is walking down the road, and he's picked up by a wagon. And they later figured out that the occupants of the wagon were James Harrison, his mother Sarah, and his sister, Mrs. William Haney, Annie Harrison. So conversation was around Haney's whereabouts, allegedly in the US. Pardon me. And the threat was made that Haney would shoot Morrison if he wouldn't stand up with him. Conversation later with John Shaw around the, again, closer to the Navan area. And again, this time Harrison threatened to give Morrison a good thrashing again. He's really going to clean up on Morrison when he has a chance. Later on in a conversation with John Ronan, he's another big farmer down here in the Southwest. Harrison starts off with the usual story about Morrison being cowed by the women. But then he says he'd send to Bell's Corners for Haney. So there's that story about Haney being in the United States. He actually was in Bell's Corners the whole time, and that Haney would, that he would vindicate him. And then further stated that Haney would give Morrison a quote unquote pill, that he wouldn't take any more prisoners. Mr. Ronan was he was a fairly substantial man in the community, and he cautioned Harrison to stay away from Haney as he was a bad character. So William Haney then a little later arrives back home with his in-laws, and he immediately went to see James Lowry down here. Because the complainants are now gone out west, he goes to see James Lowry, the JP who had issued the 2 warrants against him, and to give himself up. As usual, his brother-in-law James was with him. So Haney used some pretty rough language in speaking about Mr. Hamilton, the other justice of the peace, and about Constable Morrison. Mr. Lowry, Justice Peace Lowry, responded that neither man was entitled to such language, and he'd put the law on Haney if he didn't stop it. Haney requested that Lowry grant him a warrant, which he refused. And then the 2 of them left, saying they'd go and see another justice of the peace to get this warrant. June the 25th, 1880. According to Environment Canada records, it dawned a cool morning. So John Morrison would have milked and performed his chores early, as he's scheduled to travel his stallion that day. And it was going to be a hot day. Travel his stallion. Most farmers at that time would have had maybe only 1 or 2 horses, and they would have been mares. So somebody that had the cash, which I suspect Morrison may have got from his part-time police duties, he was able to buy this stallion, and he was able to travel around the country with the stallion then and make himself a little bit more cash. So he was traveling that day with his stallion. It was going to be a hot day, so he'd be up early in the morning, get his chores done, and he could be off. He would have said goodbye to his 8-year-old daughter, Jenny, his sons, James 5 and West 2, and he would have said goodbye to his wife, Isabella, who was currently 6 months pregnant. At about 9 o'clock that morning, Bill Haney and James Harrison arrived at Samuel Rothwell's. So up north here, up near where Navan is. So Justice Peace Rothwell's. And Haney wanted to know how to get out of the warrant that was against him, and stated he'd already seen Lowry, who didn't want anything more to do. So Rothwell's advice was surrender himself to Constable Morrison. Haney wondered whether he should bring Harrison as a witness. And the response was, yeah, there'd be no harm to it, have a witness to what you're doing. Rothwell answered them that he could go about, the next question was, what if Morrison wouldn't arrest him? That was a very important question. And the JP answered them, well, then they could go about their business, and that was going to be the end of it. Rathwell also offered to sit with them with Justice of the Peace Lowry to get things cleared up with him. So later that morning, there was a group of men gathered at Gilbert Nelson's farm, lot 18, concession 7. So here we are here at number 6, where the yellow star is, Gilbert Nelson. Present that morning were James and John Nelson, William Simpson, Duncan Dashney, John Murray, and Morrison's father-in-law, Henry McNally. Since haying didn't start generally until the 12th of July, it may very well have been a work bee of some sort. Maybe they were putting together a shed or raising a barn or some such thing. So the men were already gathered there, and John Morrison, who was traveling with the stallion, was the last man to arrive. So he got there, and then he's fussing with his horse. No doubt he's removing the saddle and getting the horse all ready to go. And John Harrison Sr.'s farm is right next door, up number 4 here. So James Harrison and Bill Haney were waiting for Morrison. Clearly they knew this was going to happen. They were next door neighbors, so they knew Morrison would be coming that day. So they were waiting at the end of the laneway. Haney called out to Morrison to come out to the road, and Morrison replied he'd be out as soon as he was done with his horse. His father-in-law, Henry McNally, who was still sitting in his wagon in the lane, urged him not to go. Morrison then turned to John Murray, William Simpson, and James Nelson and asked if they'd come out with him, as he thought they might have a weapon. And they found the 2 men sitting on a pile of logs. Haney asked if he had a warrant for him today. Morrison replied that he didn't, and he didn't want anything more to do with them. And that, friends, is where the story should have ended. It didn't. Our friend James Harrison said something to Morrison. Again, this is a very small country. All of these same people that James Harrison was going chirping to, repeating this story, mean-mouthing Morrison, they're all Morrison's friends and neighbors as well. So John Morrison, this big burly, part-time cop, farmer, full-time farmer, part-time cop, he knows all the same things that Harrison has been going around chirping around the country. So I expect he's not particularly pleased with him. Harrison says something to Morrison. Morrison lost his temper. He threw his hat on the ground and he told him to dry up. I'd have no more of your chaff. And he shook his fist in his face 2 or 3 times, right in Harrison's face. Harrison caught a hold of Morrison, and Morrison, being the big guy, he just shook him off and he caught him by the scruff of the neck. So he's hanging on to Harrison like this. And Haney got up off the pile of logs. He cursed Morrison and he said, "Let Harrison go or I'll shoot you." The 2 men had already separated at this point. The 2 men had already separated. Haney pulled out his pistol. He advanced several paces and he fired. Morrison clasped his side and cried, "Boys, I'm shot." Haney called out, "Well, I guess that'll do you, and if not, I'll give you more." And he cocked his pistol and as he said it. Holding his side, Morrison walks to the Nelson home with Harrison following him. Bill Haney fled the scene. Gilbert Nelson grabbed his gun and pursued Haney, but he returned home shortly thereafter. His son, James, went to fetch Dr. Scott. The aftermath. Dr. Scott found Morrison in a great deal of pain with a bullet wound about 2 inches below the right nipple. He did not attempt to remove the bullet. Morrison said, "Doctor, they gave me a hard one," and he thought he was going to die. Samuel Rathwell, the Justice of the Peace, arrived to take a deposition. Morrison repeated that he thought he was going to die. Rathwell asked the doctor if it would be okay to question Morrison, and the doctor replied that he was in better condition to be spoken to now than he would be a little later. So while Dr. Scott had not told Morrison his opinion on the injury, Morrison did overhear this conversation. John Morrison understood that his case was hopeless. The JP then asked Morrison how the affair had occurred. Unfortunately, Constable Morrison's dying declaration was not entered into testimony, and I haven't been able to find it. County Constable John Morrison died in agony 20 hours later on Saturday, June 26th. Dr. Laux from Russell was also in attendance, and Dr. Ferguson from Cumberland Village began his inquest the evening that Morrison died. Amongst those called to testify at the inquest was James Harrison. He did not show. The inquest was concluded the next day, and Harrison didn't arrive until after a verdict had been reached. He was taken into custody and sent to the prison at Lornial. The trial. On October 15th, 1880, James Harrison stood trial in Lornial for the murder of County Constable John Morrison. While the judge declined to hear the dying declaration, he did hear from both eyewitnesses to the murder, witnesses to the events leading up to the murder, and others testifying to James Harrison's good character. The Honorable R.W. Scott appeared for the Crown and Mr. Gibb for the defense. Chief Justice Haggerty presided at the trial. Justice Haggerty, in charging the jury, said that if Haney had been on trial, they could have no hesitation from the evidence given there today in deciding what to do. A murder of the most willful character had been committed. He pointed out that in the present case, the only question to be considered was whether or not there had been a preconcerted notion between the prisoner and Haney, whether or not they had made it up between themselves to commit murder. He then recapitulated the circumstances of the affair as detailed by one of the witnesses, Henry McNally, the Morrison's father-in-law, saying that he had never seen a case in which the witnesses agreed so well together in the main as to what occurred. Mrs. Haney was some 400 yards off, which he considered to be a matter of a long distance for a person to speak with certainty as to what took place in the scuffle. At the time the shooting occurred, Harrison was not in Morrison's grip at all, and consequently, Haney could not have had the intention of separating them. He expressed the opinion that Harrison had done nothing during this affair to show that he was acting in concert with Haney for an improper purpose. He afterwards reviewed the testimony as to the threats made, leaving the jury to decide for themselves the amount of reliance to be placed on the evidence of the different witnesses and the importance to be attached to the words used. He referred in particular to the evidence from Rothwell, which accounted for the presence of Harrison and Haney at Nelson's house, and also to the testimony which had been given to the prisoner's good character. He reminded them that they were to give the prisoner the benefits of any doubts they might have. The Daily Citizen, dated October 16th, 1880, carries the headline, "The Bear Brook Murder Trial," with the subheading, "A Verdict of Not Guilty." The trial had lasted 1 day. Sorry. As for William Haney, some reports had him in the United States and as far away as Brazil. He died in 1930. Others, including eyewitness accounts, put him up in the Pontiac. He was also observed near his wife's home and in the city of Ottawa. He was never arrested and died in 1930. We talked about the large families, people going west. There were a number of local families here from Cumberland Township that went up to the Pontiac. Once you had these big families and land was getting at a premium, there was lots of good land available cheap up in the Pontiac. So a good number of local families went up there. They lived there, and they would have still been in regular contact with families at home. So they'd have been sending letters back and forth. They would have visited back and forth from time to time. So eyewitnesses' accounts of Haney being up in the Pontiac, I would say, are probably fairly valid. So Haney's wife, Annie Harrison, is buried in the abandoned Patterson Presbyterian Cemetery in Bear Brook, along with the Harrison family. Isabella Morrison gave birth to a son, William Edward Morrison, on September 21st. Her father, Henry McNally, died within a year and a half. Her son, Wes, died in 1889. So here's this young widow. She lost her father-in-law. She lost her husband. She has yet another baby. Her father dies, and then one of her sons dies. In the 1901 census, I cannot find Isabella living in the area at all. However, there is an Isabella Morrison in Brockville in the mental hospital. She's back home for the 1911 census, and she died on May 22nd, 1911. The death certificate here, Isabella Morrison, and the cause of death is melancholia and general debility, and she suffered from this for 11 years. She breaks my heart. During further research, the Morrison family lived in this immediate area. Their parents lived here. They lived here, so he has to be here someplace. They have to be here someplace. I'm very familiar with the Anglican cemetery at Bearbrook. They weren't there. I'm very familiar with the United Church Cemetery in Bearbrook. They weren't there. I went to the Presbyterian, the abandoned Presbyterian cemetery where Haney's wife is and where Harrison family is. He wasn't there. I went on Find a Grave. I looked on Find a Grave. I couldn't find him. He's got to be someplace. He can't be far. So finally, my wife and I went. The North Russell Union Cemetery is only a couple of miles from here. It's probably about 2 miles from where Morrison's home was. We tramped it and tramped it and tramped it. And finally, I found this listed under John Morris, John and Isabella Morris. And it turns out that the name Morris or Morrison was very common at that time, that one would morph into the other. So I had finally found John Morrison. So that's the story about John Morrison's murder. The secret, you ask. In the present time, 2023, the murder of a cop is a big deal. And sadly, we just saw this a couple of weeks ago. It makes, with all the media attention, it stays in the news cycle for at least a week or more. And this murder that we had here was national in coverage. So in a time before TV, radio, internet, telephone, any rapid communication, news spread via the newspapers and by word of mouth, and people would retain and pass along these stories for many, many years. So as I noted, my brother and I heard the story from our father, and his father would have been 9 years old at the time of the murder. And the Simpson family were actually cousins of his. Surprisingly, my dad's version was actually pretty close to what I eventually discovered, which wasn't necessarily so with all of father's stories. So as Jerry alluded, some storytellers are a little more colorful than accurate. So anyway, his story actually was pretty close. Another place where I saw the story, or I found the story, was a first cousin of my maternal grandfather. He related the story many years later. He was born 13 years after the murder, but he lived on the farm immediately next door. And when he came of age and bought a farm, he bought the John Morrison farm. I spoke with, trying to get background and find information about this. I spoke to our local village historian, and she is so aware of so many things, so knowledgeable, it's unbelievable. She had only heard the story once, and that was my father and her father were down there visiting together, talking about it. That is the only time in her life she heard this story, which is really curious. I'm getting more curious all the time. What the heck is going on here? So I tracked down descendants of almost everybody that was there that day. All of those people that were firsthand witnesses, I was able to find, great-grandchildren, great-nieces and nephews, still living in the area, still a small community. We still got that intermarriage thing going on. So I tracked down all these descendants, and like I say, the murder of a cop is big news. Why wasn't it passed on? Not a single one of these people was aware of this, not one. One woman that I spoke with, an elderly woman, the murder had taken place on her grandfather's farm. She played on that farm as a child. She never heard of it. Why didn't anybody hear about it? We can only speculate. My thought, my guess, given the homogenous nature of the community and how everybody was interconnected and interrelated, maybe it was just too uncomfortable to discuss or too embarrassing to remember. The thing that my father's version did vary greatly was in who he blamed it on. Other than that, his story was pretty accurate. So there's the mystery. It remains a mystery to this day. We can only speculate. Now, just as a little bit of an addendum, in preparing to do this presentation for the Cumberland Historical Society a couple of years ago, I spoke with a friend, Charles Watson. The farm that Charlie is on is right next door to the farm where Bill Haney owned, the Haney farm. At the time, the farm that Charlie was on was owned by the Birch family. And like many of the rest of us, the Birches and the Haneys had married back and forth over several generations. So where this is going, when in 1981, Charlie decided he was going to build a new barn. So he tore down the old log barn and he came to a great vacant, a large void in the wall. And he asked his father, what's this void about? This is where they hid Bill Haney after the murder. Then they put him in a casket, they put him in a coffin, and they painted smallpox or typhoid or some such contagious disease on the side of the coffin, and they spirited him out of the country. About the same time, I was able to get a hold of Jerry Haney. Jerry was 94 years old, and he is a great nephew of Bill Haney's. And I asked him for his version of the story. And his family view story was that a guy was beating up a friend of Bill's, and that Bill killed him to protect his friend. But he also added the side note that nobody in the family was allowed to call their child Bill or William since that time. So folks, that's the story of the murder of County Constable John Morrison. I hope you've enjoyed it. And that's the secret. And if anybody can figure out the secret, we're more than happy to talk to you. I think Ben is willing to entertain questions.
Thanks, Ivan. I'll get you to unshare the screen now.
Okay, stop sharing.
I have to say, a fascinating story, and you guys are great storytellers and great stories, and particularly fascinating from both of you, just listening about your passion for research and telling us your journeys in researching these different stories. So Jerry, to answer your question, you said you didn't know whether we would find this interesting. I think we found it definitely interesting. And some of the parallels I found interesting too. You know, we've heard a lot about Peter Aylin and the Shiners and the fact that these poor constables in Bytown, this is a few decades earlier, they had to somehow compete with this large gang, and somehow if they arrested somebody, get them to the courthouse in Perth. Well, for Cumberland Township, it was Lorignal. It was a little bit similar. And, you know, talking about the links with Montreal, when I think about Bytown, I think about the Oblate brothers, I think about Elizabeth Briere and the Grey Nuns. All of it comes from Montreal, these connections with Montreal before Upper Canada really developed and became an entity that competed with Lower Canada. Interesting describing the makeup, Jerry, of Cumberland Township. You know, talking about the fact that you've got Orleans, very urban, and then you've got the rural part. And I'm guessing that little small part of Orleans has more people than the rural part. Thinking about the coexistence for many generations of English and French, of Protestant and Catholic, you know, names like Morin and McNeely and Camerons all together. So I'm going to ask you a question to start off with. Yes or no? Would you say Cumberland Township is like a microcosm of Canada itself to some extent, or not?
That all I can say about Cumberland Township, there's a big history. So I don't know about a microcosm of Canada, but one of my ancestors who wrote a book called The Morin Odyssey said there's the big history and then there's the little histories associated with it. So I was just appreciative of finding out Cumberland's story because it factors into the big history and the people vote. And when there's, I don't know if people are aware, there was a Catholic church that mysteriously burned down in Cumberland in 1866. So there things have gone on that are quiet, but for the most part, my sense is that a whole pile of different people came to a place and was much more complex than I thought it was, and learned how to live together. And for the most part, it was a successful story. Like, in other words, I think I was brought up that, you know, to appreciate Canadian values in terms of being humble and peaceful. But I also knew that there were lots of people had lots of hangups. So I don't know if it's a microcosm of Canada. It's just another one of the stories that feed into Canada.
I was particularly interested in the fact that the French and Irish Catholics continue to share a church because of the populations. And again, I go back to Bytown, where the Oblates had tried to bring the French and Irish together, created La Collège de Bytown, which of course became the University of Ottawa. But still, the Irish and French Canadians didn't really, they remained separate. And I'm just wondering if in Cumberland Township, these people who shared the Catholic faith became closer than they did in other jurisdictions where they were more populous.
Well, when I went to church in Cumberland with my grandparents, there was a mass that was said in English and there was a mass that was said in French. And in Sarsfield, it has become majority French. And in Rockland, which was unilingual French in my childhood, it now has an English-speaking parish. It's not Irish or French, it's French and English, in that there's communities who don't want to share their churches. So, you know, that sometimes I think we forget the Christianity part. The language part is more important. So, you know, in some senses, there are people who cooperate. In other ways, there's still all these rivalries that go on, and sometimes within a parish. So I'm not sure that lots has changed. But certainly the divisiveness that used to be there is not as bad. There's a lot more cohesive stuff going on, but there's still, you know, all of these human intricacies.
So I'll remind everybody, if you've got some questions, please type them into the chat box. I see that Marcia has a question. She's curious about constables being tax collectors.
I honestly don't know that. I did not see that. I don't believe they were. They were basically multi-purpose for every other kind of law enforcement, but to the best of my knowledge, they were not tax collectors.
And Brian Cook, I think you had a couple of things that you'd mentioned in the chat box. Did you like to speak to those? We'll get Jacob to make sure you're unmuted.
I think I'm unmuted.
Excellent.
First of all, Jerry and Ivan, absolutely incredible.
Thank
The
you.
Cumberland Historical Society has done incredible work, and I don't know if anybody was at the last session of the HSO when things were out on the table to buy, but the quality of the research and the quality of the products of the Cumberland Historical Society is just magnificent, magnificent. So congratulations for all your hard work. And Ivan, I read the book.
Oh, good.
And I also read the book about the other murder that took place in Navan. That's another story for somebody to tell sometime. A couple of things. I also wrote a book on St Andrew's United Church and the history of St Andrew's United Church, which is the Presbyterian Church. And I wrote it with Joan Lancaster, who probably you know well, and Denise Beaton. And I actually was able to trace the original horseback minister to his gravestone in Lorignal. So that was an interesting, and I've had a wonderful time looking at Cumberland. And I got to know Denise Beaton very well. Their property, as you know, is off the Willhaven Road, just to the left of, as you go up Dunning, and you see a ridge above it. And on that ridge, when you can go hiking on that ridge with permission, of course, you can actually see the forced road. It's still there, it's still wide, and you can actually go visit it. Also, along the sides there of the forced road, you can actually see the seashells from the old Champlain Sea. So, any case, those just asides. Tremendous stuff. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And before the session, I was mentioning our latest pamphlet is by Brian Cook. It's a story that started on the other side of Ottawa, Lanark County, but it's a great pamphlet. It's now available on our website. I do have one more question, and that is for Ivan and Jerry, if we have some folks who are from Cumberland Township tonight, or have some history or some interest with Cumberland Township, and they would really like to get involved with the great work that you've been doing, what would be the best way for them to get into contact with either one of you?
The best bet right now is probably if they go on our website, and I think the email is info@cths, Jerry.
Yeah.
And yeah, anybody that's interested, or particularly anybody that's interested in helping out or becoming involved, feel free to get in touch with us at your convenience.
Yeah, so if they just Google the Cumberland Township Historical Society, it'll come up and they'll see how to contact you and give you a shout on that.
Yeah.
Jacob, if we could just allow anybody else to unmute, just in case anybody else has any questions they'd like to directly ask Jerry and Ivan tonight.
Yeah, sure. It's
And
if anyone is interested, it's on.
I have a question. What was the main reason for the acquittal or the not guilty?
It appears to me that they really concentrated on James Harrison's character, and by reading the judge's charge, it almost appears to me as if he was pushing them in that direction. I would have certainly thought he was an accomplice. I mean, worst case scenario, somebody should have given him a slap in the side of the ear just for being such a busybody and such a disturber. Thank God I don't know anybody that disturbs things that badly much.
Thank you.
Scott.
Great.
Any other questions tonight? Well, that sounds like a wrap. Again, Ivan and Jerry, we really enjoyed your presentation tonight. You really gave us a flavor for a time and a place, and an appreciation for what is now part of the city of Ottawa that I think many of us weren't as familiar with. And really want to thank you for giving us such an excellent presentation to finish off our spring speaker series.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Night, everybody.
See you in September.
Thanks for coming.